Is Tennessee reloading or rebuilding? The Vols kept Nico, Mike Matthews, Boo Carter, but they've lost more than they've gained in the transfer portal, and the core of last year's playoff team is now headed to the NFL. Welcome to the Volunteer State. I'm Tennessee beat writer Adam Sparks, along with John Adams of the Knoxville News Sentinel. On this episode, we'll kick off the new year with a fresh new look at the UT football roster in 2025. But first, John, before we get to that, I want to welcome back our loyal listeners. I've gotten some feedback over the last couple of weeks, which basically boils down to where's the pod? Where's the Vols pod? We've been away for, I don't know, 2, maybe 3 weeks for various reasons.
Sure. So, yeah.
I mean, it's for different reasons. It's Christmas and New Year's. We both took a little bit of vacation time, took a few days off, travel schedules didn't line up. If I remember right, John, I don't remember if you were on vacation or not, but one of those weeks I had lost my voice.
Yes, I remember that. And so did our SEC or National College Football columnist, Blake Totmeyer. We do a SEC Unfiltered together. And his got better in time to do the podcast. Yours didn't. That's can't do podcasts without a voice. Just
yeah. I don't know what was going around the holidays, but it was still good to get a little time off. John, you already know this, but I even had a medical mishap in Montreal just a few days ago before coming back from back into the States. My wife and I spent New Year's in Montreal for a very short vacation. And I guess this can, if nothing else, can add comic relief to the podcast. My advice to anyone who grew up in the South and has only lived in the South, never get into a cold plunge tub in Canada in the winter. Don't do that. If you're thinking about, you probably nobody else out there is thinking about doing that. Unfortunately, I did, and it didn't go well. We were in. I'll tell the story quickly, and John, I know you've already heard a little bit of it. Over New Year's, we were in Montreal. There's I've had back surgery and all that a few years back, and so we like to, anytime we do a short vacation, we like to get a massage. So we were going to a place to get a massage, and they had this thing. It's well known in Montreal, which we found out. They do a sort of a water cycle or whatever, where you do a sauna, like 130 degrees or whatever it is, a sauna, and then a cold plunge. So a plunge in an icy cold tub for just a few seconds. It's supposed to be reinvigorating, which it absolutely is. And then you go and do a hot tub, and then you start the cycle over and you do it all over again. I went through the first time perfectly fine. The second time I went through, I did the sauna. I was dehydrated. It was super hot. And this spa is on basically a yacht. It's a big boat that's harbored on the St. Lawrence River in Montreal, where it was the river was frozen over, and you go outdoors into a cold plunge tub after getting out of a sauna. The second time through, I dipped down in the cold plunge, and my immediate thought was, I think my heart just stopped. I think my heart is not beating anymore. It was that cold. If you have issues with being cold, which I do, if you've ever jumped into a pool that's just a little bit too cold, those first 10 seconds, you get short of breath trying to adjust to it. Imagine that times 100. And that's what happened to me in this cold plunge. I got up out of it, could not even catch my breath. My wife was the next one to go through. She was reaching back for my hand to help her up into this cold plunge tub, and reach back, and I was not there, and she heard kerplunk behind her. And that was the back of my head hitting a stone floor, because I had passed out completely, just hyperventilated, I guess. Don't remember any of it, but fell backwards, hit my head. And John, I can tell you, 911 in Canada is also, it's the same number. It's 911. They don't have a different system there, because some some French Canadians called 911, and we had to actually cancel an ambulance. I'm not sure how my insurance would have handled it if I went through the Canadian healthcare system, but thankfully I got cleared from any concussion possibilities and made it back to the States. John, over your holiday, did you also jump into any cold plunges in a foreign country and nearly die? Anything like that?
Well, for starters, Adam, I grew up in South Louisiana, and cold weather is not my friend. I don't like it below 80 degrees. It never gets too hot for me. And I was having back problems too. So I went and got a massage. I went to Powell, Tennessee, and there was no cold plunge. There was no knockout thrown. Man, I wouldn't go near Canada in the winter. So I admire your courage and your how adventurous you are, but you might want to be a little more careful next winter.
Yeah, I won't do that again. And I've covered athletes for many, many years who get into cold tubs after ice tubs. Right? You go and you practice, and then to cool off, they get in an ice tub. It's just, I just have to say, it's a little different. I would hate those too, but there's a difference between getting in ice water after a 3-hour practice and getting into, I think it was the psychology of it, that I was already outdoors in Canada and the river was iced over. And so I was already freezing, then getting into.
Adam, you could have had a heart attack.
Yeah. That's, I think that's what my wife thought. When I came to, she was trying to do all the questions, and she said, there's medical people over me and all that. And she said, "Who's the president?" And for a split second, I was completely aware of what, that I knew sort of where I was at. And she said, "Who's the president?" And I thought about saying Trudeau, just to acknowledge where I was. That would have been an easier.
You might be wrong on that by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah, I will be. Yes. Depending on which day this goes up, I would be. The medical staff there said, "How do you feel?" And I said, like Jack in the movie Titanic after the ship goes down, because I felt like, when he gets pushed off into the abyss, in the frozen abyss at the end of that movie. That's sort of how I felt. My wife was not very merciful, but not very gracious afterwards, I'll have to say. She was in the moment, she was scared, but then after the fact, there was some onlookers that said, "Man, he looks really, really pale." And she said, "No, he always looks like that."
Yeah.
So, which, by the way, is saying something if you're saying that to Canadians. I was not south of the border. I was north of the border, and they acknowledged that I was really, really pale.
You fit right in.
I know, right? So that was my New Year. I hope the rest of you out there had a really good New Year, a safe New Year, maybe safer than that, I hope. But Tennessee had, I'll say, an eventful New Year, but in some respects, the lack of events as far as roster moves. There were some scares in there for a little bit of time. I think a lot of us thought there was a chance that Nico could be gone in the portal. That never happened. Mike Matthews tested the idea of going into the portal, did not go, ultimately stayed with Tennessee. Boo Carter, the same thing. John, we're at an odd place now where there's celebrations online of players tweeting graphics from the NIL collective announcing that they're staying on the team they were already on. That's where we're at now. I'm staying. It's an odd place in college football. I think for a lot of fans, it's frustrating because you don't know who's on the team from year to year. But so I just, John, I want to do this episode just sort of open-ended because we have a lot to react to with what's happened with Tennessee's roster, and in some instances has not happened. So let me just pitch this to you, John, to start off. Of what you've seen from the roster, do you feel encouraged that Tennessee we'll be back in the playoff next year? Or are you discouraged? And granted, we're doing this from an early January perspective, and Tennessee still has some work to do in the portal. But are you encouraged or discouraged that this is a playoff team next year based on what's on the roster?
Yeah, I'm discouraged. I think Tennessee needed to do more. Now, that may change if it makes additions later. We haven't, this thing hasn't played out, so we're not, we're not in this isn't final. The game still, the NIL transfer portal game is still going along. Here's the thing, the way I look at it. In the SEC, Tennessee has a built-in advantage. It's the same advantage it had in 2024. It has a very favorable SEC schedule, much more so than some teams I think that will be better than Tennessee. So that gives it a shot. I mean, I look at that schedule and I say, well, Tennessee could go 9-3. 9-3, that kind of puts you in the playoff hunt, depending on how, if you could go 9-3, maybe get lucky, win a 10th game, so forth. And another thing I like about it is I don't think either Alabama or Georgia, two regulars on Tennessee's schedule, I don't think they will be as good next season. So I think Florida will be a little better, but maybe not as much improved as some people think. So those look like different, maybe less challenging games than they were going into the 2024 season. But I look at what teams like LSU, Auburn, and Ole Miss are doing in the portal. I think Auburn has made itself a playoff contender by its work in the portal.
Already, one off season.
Yes, already. I think Auburn, I think LSU has made itself maybe a favorite, right up there with Texas with what it's doing portal-wise. Still work to do defensively, but it has the potential of a just dominant offense. And also Ole Miss, as usual, hasn't landed the star power it did last season in the portal, last year, but it's helped itself quite a bit. And I think its new quarterback, Austin Simmons, could be pretty good. So I'm just looking at what the competition is doing. And one thing that's really stuck out to me, Adam, wide receiver has become a high-value position in college football. And there were so many wide receivers, proven receivers, productive receivers who entered the portal. And teams like Auburn, teams like LSU, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, these teams have picked up really proven wide receivers. And that's a position of need for Tennessee. Now, it still has time to add people, but I think it's crucial that it does. The one thing that's challenging to me for coaches and can be a real guessing game, when you look at your roster, when you've had success, as Tennessee did this past season, 10-2, a bad playoff experience certainly against a really good team, but a 10-2 season, you make the playoffs, a good year, you can't get too devoted to the roster you have returning. The guys that are coming back. You got to look at it like, well, can I improve at that position through the portal? That you like to think of loyalty as being a big factor. Man, you've got to look at that depth chart and that roster and think, can I get better by making this move? And I think if you believe you can, you need to make that move.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because around the program right now, this any sense of optimism in what's going on in the off season, and maybe even spin, we could even call it spin, is that enthusiasm is based on retention. If you put some truth serum into coaches on that staff and say, you feel you don't seem as concerned as fans are about the roster. Why is that? They would tell you, kept a lot of the guys that could have left. Nico's still here. Mike Matthews is still here. Boo Carter's still here. Jermod McCoy was an All-American corner this year. they took care of him, and I'm sure in NIL, so there was no threat of him going. There's still good depth on the defensive line. They lost one D lineman, but they didn't lose like three. They get Miles Kitzelman back with the Diego Pavia rule, the junior college, so he gets a year back. They kept some pieces. Retention is what they're telling themselves in the building about why they have reason to be a little more enthusiastic than the fans. Here's the thing, though. I think that was a good reason a year ago, because a year ago you were retaining some guys that could have gone in the portal, but also COVID seniors. You're retaining 5th and 6th year guys. You're retaining starters. Right now, I think some of the enthusiasm is around that you kept young, mostly unproven players. Nico was fine this year. We could do a whole pod or a series of pods on that. I think his best football is ahead, but he was not an all-conference quarterback. There's a big celebration over keeping Mike Matthews. I think the chances are better than not that Mike Matthews will end up being a good SEC receiver. But we haven't seen it yet. I think I feel more excited about Boo Carter because I think he's already shown quite a bit. But I just look at, like, when I look at the portal. So I've got this question a lot. I think we may have even addressed this before Christmas. Why are so many guys leaving? There aren't that many guys that have left. Tennessee, the number's like 18 or 19, but if you just look at the scholarship players, Tennessee lost 13 scholarship players in the portal. And not all those guys were guys that are going to make a big impact next year, but they lost 13. I'm not alarmed by the 13 number. I'm concerned by the one that they've added. And by the time this pod episode publishes, it may be 2. Amari Jefferson is flirting with Tennessee already. I think there's a reasonable chance that Tennessee gets him. He's a 4-star receiver. A year ago, chose Alabama over Tennessee coming out of high school. He's from Baylor down near Chattanooga. So adding him would be sort of like adding he's a 4-star redshirt freshman. He didn't play at Alabama. So like Tennessee has Braylon Staley, who played just a little bit, but redshirted. He was a 4-star receiver a year ago. It's sort of like adding another Braylon Staley. So that's a guy that could help you, but he also hasn't played, so we don't know. But I'm not concerned about the 13 that were lost. I'm concerned about the 1 and maybe 2 added so far. And again, it wouldn't make as much of a difference, I think, if they had a lot of veterans coming back, but they just don't. John, I wrote something maybe a week or so ago about a look at the roster. And, their scholarship numbers, they're like 80, 81 right now. And I initially did that count because I was thinking, why they should be adding more people. What does this size up to? And what it comes out to is that they lost a lot of seniors, 5th-year seniors, 6th-year seniors, and they reloaded with freshmen, with incoming freshmen. They signed 25 guys to account for the losses in the portal and their senior class. And, that can be a reload. I can also make a pretty good case that if this was any other sport and any other level, if this was the pros or if this was college football 5 years ago, that is absolutely a rebuild. When you are losing 5th and 6th year guys and a quarter of your roster is made up of incoming freshmen, that's a rebuild. That's not a reload. And I'm not saying that's what Tennessee is doing. I'm just saying that's the strategy that they seem to be taking more so than reloading in the portal. And I don't know if that's certainly not what I think people thought they would have to put around Nico, but you can also win with really young players. We've seen college football get younger and younger in some spots. And, I'm just trying to put 2 and 2 together of what they're doing. And John, do you think my read is right? Is this just this coaching staff saying we can win with younger developmental guys rather than just going and rolling the dice on portal guys?
Well, it's possible Tennessee can, but I wonder if Tennessee even believes that, or I just think you need to upgrade through the portal, no matter who you are, no matter what level you are. And I really wonder if Tennessee is reading the room right. I just see. I look at last year's team. Uh, Three players stick out to me: James Pierce, first round draft pick, we think,
Mm-hmm.
edge rusher; Dylan Sampson, the SEC Offensive Player of the Year. One of the top 5 running backs in the country, probably.
Sure.
And Cooper Mays, underrated, perhaps, maybe not as talented as those guys, but such a huge stabilizing force, and his value to this team, to this program, was really magnified because we saw in 23 what the offense looked like without him, and not just what Cooper Mays did. You think of him, we always say he's a glue player. I guess we could call him a glue player. He's some guy, he's the kind of guy that you just don't want to lose. And if you do lose him, you don't want to replace him. I look at those 3 players, those 3 positions. How effectively can Tennessee replace them? James Pierce probably can, because I think Joshua Joseph's a really good player. They've got some real potential in that defensive line.
Yep.
And Rodney Garner has a great history of producing good defensive linemen. So, okay, there. But I don't see a running back comparable to Dylan Sampson. Maybe Peyton Lewis can become that. But I thought it was unfortunate for Tennessee that it lost Cam Seldon to the transfer portal. I think he might turn out to be a pretty good running back. He transferred to Virginia Tech. But you got Peyton Lewis, Deshaun Bishop. So you may be okay there, but I don't see an SEC Offensive Player of the Year. And I don't see anybody being the next Cooper Mays right now. So I'm just talking about these high-profile star-type players, if you will. I don't see where Tennessee is getting those kind of players. So if you could have pinpointed somebody in the transfer portal, that would, that could be a really boost to your roster. Adam, I think it's so important. You say, well, tampering isn't allowed. Okay. I mean, sure. Try enforcing that. When that transfer portal opens for business, you need, to me, already have to have a plan. You might already have such and such player at Central Michigan or at Oklahoma State or Virginia Tech or wherever. He said, that guy fits our system. That's a position of need. If that guy goes in the portal, we're going, and I think he might, we're going hard after him. I think you have a plan, and what Tennessee's done so far makes me question Tennessee's plan. Now maybe, as you brought up, maybe Tennessee honestly believes that it has the players further down the depth chart that can produce more than what these guys in the portal can. But I just can't ignore that wide receiver position. I mean, I know all these players. I've heard of all these players, and I see them going hither, there, and yon. And I think Tennessee could use him. Tennessee could use that one. Tennessee could use this one. And so I kind of question the plan, if that's the plan right now.
Yeah, whether it's right or wrong, I think the sense that certainly fans get, and I'll have to admit that I get the further we go into the calendar, is that Tennessee has been a step behind. I think some of that is fair because I think the schedule of the playoff can hurt a team. You're not preparing for a whatever bowl. You're preparing for a playoff, which is your first priority. So you can only throw so much manpower and resources and attention to trying to get guys to come in and visit, on portal visits while you're 2 or 3 days from kicking off in the college football playoff. So I think playoff teams are hurt a little bit by that. I think Tennessee didn't react as quickly to that as other teams have. I think Tennessee has missed on getting some guys on campus after the playoff. I mean, the Branch brothers, the safety and the wide receiver from USC, those guys are headed to Georgia. They never took a visit to Tennessee. Tennessee allegedly wanted to bring them in, never got them on campus. And that's sort of half the battle, just getting somebody on campus for a few hours to look over things, talk NIL, talk to the position coach, let's make a deal, and let's move the ball down the court. Tennessee has not gotten that far with the number of guys. I think they'll add, let's say they do add Amari Jefferson. I think they'll add one wide receiver at least after that. So if you get two wideouts, you start to fill that hole a little bit. They probably need at least another offensive lineman, but I still question that because you've already got a lot of money and development supposedly into the offensive line. Like eventually you just need to play the guys you've recruited and had there for a while. And if those guys aren't ready, then you've got to ask the question, why is that not the case? They do need a running back. I mean, here's the thing, John, that sort of piggybacking off your point. Part of the question is how do you replace those key guys? But then the second question is, how do you replace the guys who replace those guys? If we just imagine a depth chart up on a wall, and Tennessee and every other college football team has one of these in their room, their big board of their depth chart. And let's take running back, for example. Say, well, who's going to be Dylan Sampson? Well, maybe Peyton Lewis can develop into a Dylan Sampson. Dylan Sampson was a 3-star recruit. Peyton Lewis is at least as good as that, if not better, when coming out of high school. So maybe he can develop into that. Well, okay, if Peyton Lewis is now your number one running back, Deshaun Bishop comes back as your backup. Who's the new Peyton Lewis? Who's your number 3 or sometimes number 2? Because they need at least 3 backs. Who's the new Peyton Lewis? Well, it would be Cam Seldon. He's not here. Okay, well, then you bump up Khalifa Keith into that spot. No, he's also in the portal. So who's your new Dylan Sampson with Peyton Lewis? Who's your new Peyton Lewis? I don't know. Who's your new Cam Seldon? I don't know. Who's your new Khalifa Keith? I don't know. And some of these guys are just contributors, guys that play just a little bit. But the answer to most of those questions I just asked, the answer is, well, freshman. Bringing in a couple freshman running backs. So that's where they'll go to. I'll give you another example. At tight end, Holden Stays went into the portal. The Notre Dame transfer that was only here a year. He was fine. Who moves into his spot? Well, Ethan Davis will move into his spot. So you have Kitzelman and Ethan Davis at tight end. Okay, let's assume that works. Now, Ethan Davis did not give them much this year, but let's assume he's ready for that role, and Ethan Davis moves into that number 2 tight end spot. Who fills Ethan Davis's spot as the third tight end? Well, they've got a freshman on the roster who hasn't played, and they have 2 freshmen coming in who haven't played. Now, maybe one of those work out, but you see where I'm going, John. The answer to a lot of these questions, again, if you pump some truth serum into these coaches and you say, who's going to fill this role? The answer more times than not is a freshman, a redshirt freshman or an incoming freshman. And that can work out in a number of instances. It's not going to work out 100% of the time. And so they've got to add more transfers just so the answer isn't always a freshman. Squirrel White is gone. Braylon Staley will move into his spot. Who moves into his spot? A freshman. Caleb Webb is gone. These are depth type guys in the receiver rotation. Who takes Caleb Webb's spot? Maybe Amari Jefferson, maybe a freshman. And you do hear a lot of enthusiasm about the freshmen that they're bringing in, but you're not going to bat 1,000 with those guys. And you're not going to bat 1,000 with the guys that redshirted this year that will play next year. So, again, I'll just hammer home the point that the more I look at this roster, the more it jumps out to me that they are intentionally going younger and sort of betting on their development that they can win going younger. And it's a pretty big bet because, John, you and I have talked about this off the air a number of times. Josh Heupel's his timeline at UCF was that he won pretty big. He won big with Scott Frost's players. And then as you got 2 years, 3 years into it, they performed not as well, and there was a decline in what they were doing. You could say his last year was a COVID year and that sort of thing. That's a reasonable excuse, but they're now going into the stage of this where the Jeremy Pruitt recruits that were the offensive linemen are gone. The Jeremy Pruitt recruits that were a lot of the D line are gone. A lot of them were Heupels, but some of them were also the previous staffs. Wide receiver was great 2 years ago, the best in the country. Those were primarily Jeremy Pruitt recruits, and so they're going young this year. They're going with new faces, and they're going with their guys. It looks to me to be more of a clean break, unless they can add some portal guys. Now, those are not their recruits, but they would be guys that they chose. Here's another reason why I want to see them go a little more into the portal is that they did really well in the portal last year. I mean, I've written about it. It was like 8, 9 guys, and you could make a case that those were all hits to some extent. Some of them underperformed, like Chris Brazel. They wanted to be a difference-making receiver. He was a contributing receiver. He produced a little bit, had a couple of good games, but they need more out of him. But, he still contributed, and the other guys contributed. There were no outright misses in the portal last year, and there were some enormous hits like Jermon McCoy. So, hey, guys, last year looked like you were really good at the portal, so maybe you should go deeper into it. And time's not up by any means, and probably a week from now we'll record a pod episode where we talk about a couple guys that they add this week. But to this extent, classes are starting this week for a number of schools. They won't start at Tennessee for a couple weeks, so they've got time, but they don't have endless options out there, and I still think they need to fill some holes before they get a team that looks like one that could get back to the playoff. John, if you picked out a position where they got to add, it's got to be wide receiver, right? Like they can get over other things. It's got to be wide receiver.
Yeah, in today's game, we've seen the value continue to rise for wide receivers, and I guess the best measuring stick for that right now is the hottest team in football is Ohio State, which has had 2 incredible performances in the playoffs. Dominant receivers. I mean, its second receivers, best receivers, probably better than 90% of the receivers in the country. We've seen the difference you can make, the impact you can have, and particularly in a system like Josh Heupel's. Go back to the 22 season when Jalen Hyatt had such an impact. That's what's odd to me, is that Tennessee doesn't seem to value receivers and doesn't look at receivers like, okay, these guys are pretty good, but we got to get better. We got to just keep getting better. I guess ideally you want to get a Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, 6'3", 225, runs like the wind, and looks like he should be playing for the Kansas City Chiefs right now. I think you mentioned that maybe Tennessee thought Chris Brazel was better than he was based on what he did at Tulane. He's not a difference maker. He's okay. But that's where I'm seeing other teams in this league. Well, LSU's a great example. I mean, LSU has a couple of really good receivers coming back, but what does it do? It gets Barry and Brown at Kentucky, a speed guy who's also a kick returner, one of the better kick returners in the country, but a speed guy who can stretch a defense. Nick Anderson at Oklahoma, who was hurt this past season, but the year before as a freshman caught 10 touchdown passes. Another player that could stretch the field. I think either one of those guys would have been a really nice addition to Tennessee. It's like Tennessee doesn't have a number 1 receiver. I'm not even sure if it has a number 2 receiver. I just don't see a guy that could do what Jalen Hyatt did in 22, stretch the field, go deep, break a play, make a play. and open up other aspects of your offense. See, that to me, going into this transfer portal, going into the postseason, that's like my number, I'm pointing up there, number one goal. Got to get that. We need some other things, but if I were there, I would say, yeah, but you got to get this. You got to get this receiver. And I look at the emphasis other SEC teams have placed on that. Texas A&M said, we got to get better at receiver. You get Concepcion from NC State. And right on down the line, you've seen Auburn already had a couple of good receivers, and it adds more. It gets Eric Singleton from Georgia Tech. That, to me, Adam, is where Tennessee is missing the boat. And maybe it'll get that guy before it's all over. But if it doesn't, I don't see where the next receiving corps is going to be much better than this one.
Yeah, you have to wonder if, as we record this on Monday evening, there's still 4 teams alive in the college football playoff, and those players will have 5 days after they're eliminated, after their last game, for their players to go into the portal. You have to wonder if there's any possibilities on those teams for Tennessee to grab a player or two, particularly at wide receiver. And just for the listeners to know, like we're not trying to pile on this team from what Josh Heupel has done already with this team. It's a phenomenal season. The fact that they won the games they did, they got to the college football playoff, is very admirable. And some of the players we're talking about that are returning could turn into really good players. I think there's a difference between a player that develops from an okay player to a good player. That's one thing. Another thing is just having a dynamic skill set that you can see from day one. And I think that second group is where I think they're potentially lacking. Jalen Hyatt, they found the best way to utilize him in Josh Heupel's offense to get him open. But I would say even a year before he popped, if you went out day one of Josh Heupel's first practice at Tennessee, the season where Jalen Hyatt did not produce that much, I think it was still evident that he had something, that he could run past people, and when he got the ball, he could do something with it. He was injured, and they couldn't quite figure out the position to play him at. But he had that. Velus Jones Jr. even had a little bit of that. Give him the ball, he's going to turn 8 yards into 20 yards. And I just didn't see that out of Tennessee. Peyton Lewis could develop into a very good running back. I question whether or not he's got the wiggle of a guy that's going to break a whole lot of 70-yard runs. Mike Matthews has shown something. Whether he develops into that game breaker, I don't know. Braylon Staley, I've seen good things out of him out of practice, but they didn't think he was good enough to play as a freshman until the end of the year. And by the way, when Matthews and Staley played, Matthews had a couple touchdown catches. Other games he played and people didn't notice him. A freshman. I'm not trying to rip the guy. Braylon Staley played in the playoff game. Did not have a catch. Had a couple targets. Did not get open. A lot of that is the problem of the offense and things that Josh Heupel and Joey Halsley and those coaches need to figure out to get guys open. But they do need a dynamic element on this offense, and particularly at wide receiver, so that they're utilizing Nico. And John, I think about the kickoff classic, the opener being Atlanta in the 2025 season against Syracuse. I think of what they're going from and what they're going to in terms of, again, of the depth chart. I think it's very possible that instead of Cooper Mays, it's William Satterwhite, who at that point will be, I guess, a redshirt freshman, snapping the ball to Nico. Nico handing or faking a handoff to Peyton Lewis, who is now your bell cow running back instead of your number 3. And then him looking out there and trying to figure out who he's going to throw to. Mike Matthews, Chris Brazzell, Braylon Staley, or maybe a transfer or two. And that I can see some reasons for enthusiasm about individuals that I just named, and especially long term, But I also see as many reasons to be concerned about the combination that I just said, because I just don't feel like there's a lot of safe bets in the combination that I just said there. And by the way, John, Boo Carter supposedly is going to work somewhere into this. Boo Carter, who was star position nickelback on defense this season, was freshman All SEC at two different positions. Boo Carter was freshman All SEC as a defensive back and was freshman All SEC as a returner, a very dynamic punt returner. We're not just making this up. This isn't. We're just not throwing things against the wall here, because Stephen Hargis, good friend down at the paper in Chattanooga, actually reported he talked to Boo Carter's family, and Boo Carter's family said the reason he was considering leaving was a discussion about playing on offense, and that was something that he was told during recruiting. He would have a chance to play on offense as well. So, and I would think Boo Carter, if he's playing on offense, would probably be in the slot. That's where you would use a guy with some wiggle like him. John, I've heard, again, we're reacting to things that's happened over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I heard some back and forth from Tennessee fans about how they feel about that, about a guy finishing up his freshman year, seemingly strong-arming the coaches a little bit, saying, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we're speculating a little bit here. You guys said you'd play me on offense. I'm going to play on offense, or maybe I go somewhere else where I can play on offense. And the obvious possibility there is he was recruited heavily by Colorado, where Travis Hunter went and did both ways this year. John, are you okay with that if that did happen that way, or are you okay with Boo Carter playing a little bit on offense this next season?
Very much so. He looks like a really good athlete. He looks like somebody, you see it on returns. You think about that's exactly what Tennessee needs. It's somebody that can make a difference. It's somebody can turn a short play into a long play. It's somebody can turn a first down into a touchdown. And I'm not sure he's that guy because I haven't seen enough of him, but he at least has potential. And to me, you could say, okay, he's angling, he's using his leverage, he's angling for a better NIL deal. That's the world in which we live. It happens all the time. However, to me, the mere fact that he's saying he wants to play offense too, that tells me how confident he is. And really good players are also usually really confident. Yes. They really believe in themselves. That comes with that talent. They think, I can do that. Travis Hunter did it. I can do what he did. I can play that many plays. So, as a coach, to me, the main thing you can do is get a player to bring out the very best in a player. And at least find out if this player could play offense and defense. Don't limit him. Find ways to stretch his game as much as you can. So I would welcome that. I think it would be, what can go wrong? You give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, you just go back to the more traditional, conventional way, and he plays on one side of the ball. But think of it this way, Adam. If you're a coach and you've got this great athlete, a Travis Hunter, if you will, or maybe a Boo Carter, and you say he's just as good at receiver as he is at nickelback or cornerback, and you said you've got to pick one position for him to play, same ability at each position, would you rather have him on offense or defense?
Well, he's needed more on offense right now. There's no question about that.
Well, okay, but here's the thing. I know that's a need for Tennessee. But let's say Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, who everybody kind of thinks is maybe the best player in college football as a freshman. Certainly he's the best, most dynamic wide receiver. if he was just as good as a defensive back, could he impact a game as much? I don't think he could.
No, I mean, situations are different. If you're a lockdown corner, you can affect the game a lot. If you're a game-breaking wide receiver, you can affect the game a lot. I think college right now is certainly leaning toward the guy that can terrify defense, a wide receiver that can take the top off. And here's the thing with Boo Carter too. I think there's got to be some nuance in the Boo Carter conversation. Tennessee staff was criticized that they did not use him on offense this year. There were some whispers throughout the year like, hey, you need a dynamic guy on offense. Boo Carter's sitting out there. Why can't you give him 5 or 6 plays, throw the ball to him a couple times? Imagine had they done that and they said, hey, he's still learning nickelback and he started by midseason. Let's throw him over on offense too. Now, we're not playing Mike Matthews as much as everybody wants, as much as Mike Matthews wants, but we're going to take a defensive guy who's also in the freshman class and putting on offense. What does that tell Mike Matthews? That says you're not only good enough to play, but a guy on defense is better than you at your position. You could have risked losing both of them instead of just one. As is, you've lost neither of them. You've kept them both, which is a double bonus, at least in this era of college football. But using him on offense next year, in a lot of instances, I would argue that's a little too gimmicky. You should recruit receivers to play receiver and DBs to play DBs. I'm turned a little bit away from that because of Travis Hunter this year. That worked out. And the fact that Tennessee changed up its receiver rotation this year where they played like 6 guys. They finally got more guys on the field. So they showed within this offense that there is ways that they can pull guys off and put other guys in, at least between series or from one possession to the other. So they have that capability to use guys on a limited basis. And what Boo Carter may have is what they need on offense. Like you mentioned, they just need a guy who can do what he does on punt returns, which is make 2 or 3 guys miss and turn 10 yards into 30 yards. They've got to have that. I don't think he's going to play a lot, but I'll be curious to see if some of that surfaces some in spring practice and in fall camp. So I guess I'm saying I'm fine with how Tennessee handled that this past season. And if they play Boo Carter some on offense, I'm kind of fine with how they would handle that this coming season. You bring in a freshman, he needs to learn defense, which he did eventually. And then he needs to learn punt returner, which he did eventually. Didn't take long, like 1 return. And then offense after that. But you can get to that in year 2 and not make a mess of things in year 1. So, John, we're going to wrap it up here in a minute, but we've both sounded pretty pessimistic, I think, on what Tennessee could be this year. But I think we're just saying there's a lot of questions, and they haven't answered them in the negative yet. It's just they haven't answered them. And that's what I'm waiting for. Who's going to fill in who's going to take this guy's place? We don't know. Who's going to take that guy's place? We don't know. Who's going to take this other guy's place? A freshman who hasn't played yet. Well, those are insufficient answers, if anything. And so I just ask more, how many of these holes can you fill, and how competitive can you be when you're rolling the dice on a whole lot of young players? If nothing else, I'm curious to see it, because I think the idea of a very young team is sort of a fun thing. As long as you don't call it a rebuild, it can be fun to watch. Let's see how these young guys perform. Let's see how these offensive linemen who have waited their turn perform. Let's see a team that plays a lot of freshmen in an era where I think you should just not redshirt anymore. Just play everybody. So I'm curious to see that, but I don't know if the fan base is prepared to see a team that could maybe build up a lot of excitement for the following year, but also go 8-4 while they're doing that. We're kind of past that. That's that's very 2021 to me, not 2025. And I think we're in the space now where you need to be competing for a playoff spot every year, because year one you got there this year, and they need to be competing for it again. And they can maybe do that with this roster, but you do have a quarterback that you've sort of built up as a guy that can take you there and take you even further. And that worked out year one. But a lot of the reason that it worked out was what you mentioned before: Cooper Mays and the like, Dylan Sampson, James Pierce, and those guys are gone. And it's a rebuild is 8-4, a reload is 10-2. And I'm just not sure which roster I'm looking at right now. But it certainly right now, early January, it seems to lean more towards the 8-4 than the 10-2. But maybe we have no idea what we're talking about. It's just, John, unanswered questions. Is that sort of where we're at with the roster?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, of course, you could say there's uncertainty with everybody. But Tennessee, again, is fortunate to have the schedule it has. It won't play Texas. It won't play LSU. It won't play Texas A&M. It won't play Ole Miss. And it won't play Auburn. I think those teams could all be in the upper half of the SEC next year. Texas, of course, is already there, but I think A&M's better. I think LSU will be a lot better. It was 8-4. So I guess it depends on how you look at it. Tennessee looks more like a playoff contender because of its schedule than it does because of its roster.
Yeah.
I look at the roster. In other words, if I were ranking teams based on, say, power rankings as opposed to where I thought they would finish in the conference, I'd probably have Tennessee 7th or 8th. Now, if you go with, I would have them higher perhaps because of the schedule. Well, look at Missouri this year. Very accommodating schedule. And Missouri it ended up winning its bowl game. So do you really think of Missouri as a 10-3 team?
Well, that's the thing, is this year we had, let's say, 6 teams that competed for 3 spots out of the SEC. You could say A&M was in there. At one point, Missouri was in there. It's about 6 teams, and SEC got three in. If you're plugging a new team into that 6, like you mentioned at the beginning of the pod, maybe Auburn, somebody like that, you're bumping a team out. And Tennessee doesn't want to be the team that just takes a half step back and therefore gets bumped out because another team did something in the offseason that bumped it in. And I think that should be the concern for Tennessee. Some of what your roster looks like this next season, but also others are making strides to get back in it. Yeah, Auburn, LSU, there's others in the conference that are going to be making moves. And so that's what Tennessee has to be aware of. I will say this to finish the pod. I suspect this may come up in future episodes, depending on what happens. Tim Banks' contract is running up soon, defensive coordinator. I understand some of the frustration around Tim Banks for how Tennessee's defense played against Ohio State and Georgia. You also won 10 games this year, largely because of the defense and Dylan Sampson. And Dylan Sampson ain't here anymore, so that leaves defense. Now, a lot of that was a defensive line personnel that had been built up over the years that we've talked about. A lot of that is Rodney Garner. A lot of that is Jermon McCoy getting a hit in the portal like that. A lot of personnel has to do with it. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Tim Banks' defense gave up 16 points a game this year, which is the lowest points per game since Tennessee's national title team in '98. Do I think this defense was as good as the '98 defense? No, not even close. This was not as much of a playmaking, turnover forcing type defense, and we saw that in Ohio State and Georgia. There was a ceiling to this defense, but they held their first 9 opponents under 20 points. That's how, John, you talk about the schedule, how you can get to 10 wins and not be one of the top 2 or 3 teams necessarily in the conference. it's by holding almost every opponent under 20 points. And Tim Banks did that with this personnel. So if you don't have to sell a portion of Neyland Stadium to get him signed up for another contract, which I don't think you do, I think you need to try to get him back. You agree, John, or you think maybe they should test the waters or other D coordinators?
Well, here's how I look at that. Josh Heupel likes continuity. He likes to be surrounded by familiar faces on his staff. He likes maintaining his staff intact, and he's done that pretty well. He's got his defensive coordinator. Josh Heupel is big on offense. That's his thing. And he's got a guy, he obviously trusts Tim Banks. So that to me is important, that he has that trust in him. So how would that affect the dynamics if he had to go somebody else? And how good would he be at selecting somebody else?
Yeah.
That fits what he wants to do, that can play complementary football to his brand of offense. He's comfortable with Tim Banks. In other words, to me, this is not on Josh Heupel's worry list. He's got plenty of things he needs to think about and maybe worry about. But he knows what he's going to get with a Tim Banks defense. He saw it this year. He's got basically the same schedule. I would be more concerned if I had to compete against a passing team as dynamic as Texas, or certainly LSU, or even Ole Miss this year with Jackson Dart. Tennessee didn't have to play those teams this year, doesn't have to play them next season either. So, yeah, I think all things considered, Josh Heupel should want him back, because you just don't know when you go out and you pick somebody that you say, yeah, you always want to upgrade. Okay, yeah, you do. But are you sure you're going to have an upgrade? And you also have to think about how this program is functioning under Heupel and what he believes in. He believes in continuity. So now when you talk about changing coordinators, you're talking about him getting outside his comfort zone. In the long run, sometimes that plays out well, but other times it can create more problems.
Yeah, a lot of times in college football, you win by putting out fires. And I'm not saying they have fires to put out with their personnel, but we spent the last hour poking holes in the roster. If you were to lose Tim Banks, suddenly you have questions about can you keep everybody on defense through the spring portal? What are you going to do about some of your most valuable assistant coaches on defense? Suddenly what you feel good about on defense is a question as much as the offense. And I think at some point you got to just say that side of the ball is working how it is, keep it intact. But of course, this will publish. This is Monday evening. This will publish not too long after we record it, and by then we may already have some news about coaching changes. I don't think so, but we could have some more news on the portal. But guys, Tennessee's bringing in. Certainly, there's a lot happening in January as the roster continues to take shape. The coaching staff continues to take shape, and there's a lot of stuff still going on around college football. You can be filled in on all from our coverage on KnoxNews.com. Also, subscribe and share to this podcast. And thank you for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.